Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, I will be discussing Blood Song by Anthony Ryan, the first book in the Raven's Shadow trilogy. So, I meant to read this book quite a while ago. I originally was going to start this last year. I had known a couple of people who had just read it and were just raving about it, and so I was really excited. Finally got to it. I'd forgotten I agreed to read it in January with some people, and so I read like half of it in January, and I finished the second half in February. But I was excited to finally get to this and try out Anthony Ryan, because I've since collected several other Anthony Ryan books that of course, once I finish this, I'll move on and read the next books. But just because of the fact that this had been praised so highly, I was really excited to get to this. So Blood Song is a book. It starts out and with the different, like each time you get to a different part of the book, you'll have a scene that's basically from the current time where the main character, Valen Alsorna, is telling his story to somebody who's basically recording it. And so most of the book is technically going to be a flashback, but it's happening generally sequentially with only brief counts from the chronicler who's basically writing down his story. And so it's done in a really good way. I know for some people that can be a little bit hit or miss when you're setting up a book like that, but I thought it worked really well, because when you're actually in the parts that are from the past, it reads really just, like I said, a linear story. It's not first person. It's just done as like this is happening basically. So I thought it worked. And so Valen, and we open it up with him being called the Hope Killer, and we're not really sure what that means, but he's apparently like done some terrible thing and is going to be like going off to his death, and that's where we start. And then we go back and get the whole story of his life. So it starts with Valen being brought into the Sixth Order, and the Sixth Order is one of the orders of the faith, and in the world here we have the realm and the faith, and there are these orders that specialize in different things. They are religious orders, but the Sixth Order is specifically for training basically people to be the greatest possible warriors. It's a very brutal training where, like from the outset, like they're, hit with canes if they mess up. They have to go through and learn how to use the sword and the bow and ride and do all kinds of other things. They go on trials where not everyone is expected to survive. And so this kind of brutal life of him growing up with that. The first thing I want to comment there is that it doesn't feel like a school setting, because technically it is kind of a school setting, but it's more of, I guess, like a battle school setting. But the way it's handled, you do get like the camaraderie between the people, and you do have them in training for weapons, for other things. It moves at a very good pace, and it just, like I said, to me it didn't feel like kind of the stereotypical school setting trope, because that is one of my least favorite tropes. And so anytime somebody would tell me that it starts out with a school setting, I was so worried. Did not bother me whatsoever. I was completely fine with it. It just didn't feel like a school, and so I think that's why I was fine with it. But we do follow Valen's life all the way up to him being an adult, still a pretty young adult, but an adult, and kind of go from there. And there's a lot of things that are being set up throughout. So the way that it's handled too, with a lot of it's him kind of going through and growing up and going through this, the Sixth Order, training basically, but we're also setting up a lot of things for the future as well. For the most part, I thought it was handled really well, where we're setting up all of these things to come up later, so that there's setup happening, but also we have our basic coming-of-age story, a pretty brutal coming-of-age story, but we still have the story moving forward very well. So it didn't feel like too much time, for the most part, was spent on setup. I think that's why I've debated on whether or not this can really be called a setup book, because it did, like, it technically should be. Because it starts with like the current time with Valen, like, recalling his life, and then that's like the book. The book ends with getting back to current, basically, and so technically everything was to set up whatever's going to happen next. Also, with a lot of the things that were set up, a lot of the big events do seem like they're going to happen in the next two. But this, for the most part, really didn't feel particularly like a setup book because it was telling a compelling enough story along with the setup. The setup was like on the way. It was a part of the story. It wasn't the focus. We weren't just setting things up. We were telling the story and learning things all throughout. So I thought this was handled really, really well. I have heard from most people that books 2 and 3 are not nearly as good as the first book, and so I will have to find out. But I'll be interested to see. I've heard part of it is just that they have a different feel from this one, which I think makes sense because of the fact that with the way the character story goes, we start with Valen being extremely young, and then the next book I imagine is going to kick off with him being where he ended up in the first book. I don't know if we're going to like jump forward in time or not, or how that's going to go, but he has some pretty significant changes over the course of the book, and so I can see the next book's feeling a bit different, especially depending on how much time passes. So I'll be interested to see. I'm definitely going to read the whole trilogy and find out for myself. I have the whole trilogy now too, so we'll definitely be going through, but I'm interested to see how that goes. I've heard still that it's worth a read, even if they're not as good as the first one. So that's just something that I'll find out. But I'm definitely still really interested to read them. Now, the one thing I will mention is, for me, the only part that started to be a little bit negative for me, as we got closer to the ending, I felt like the author just started to rely a little too heavily on the I'm just not going to tell you what's going to happen. Or like what I'm planning, like, oh, you'll see when it comes, or, all these kind of things. And that is fine when it's done in moderation, and it didn't go too far necessarily, but it just felt like it was starting to go a little bit too far. There were several things where we find out later about a conversation that was had, or, it waits until the last moment to reveal that this is what the plan was, or that kind of thing. And that it started to get to the point, like, we were already, like, this far. I just felt like that wasn't necessarily needed. So toward the ending, it felt like it was dragging a little bit, and I didn't like some of that was being done. But overall, this was a very strong story. And the very ending, once we kind of got moving and saw where we were going to go, I really did enjoy that as well, and thought it was handled really well also. This did do quite a lot of character development, not only for Valen, but for the other boys who were in basically his group that came around the same time. There's a ton of bonding with them and just kind of seeing their interactions and their camaraderie. I thought that was handled really, really well. And it does give for good moments where, these people, they're part of the order, so they call each other brother, but in a lot of ways, they really feel as if they are brothers, like they're a family. And so that being done in the world being, pretty brutal, where, they could all die on a trial or on a mission, they're being trained as warriors, they're going to be going off to war. I thought it was handled really, really well. And then also, as the further you get into the book, the more the political machinations become more clear, where you see all of the different things going on, and what, like, the story that's told to the people is, but what's really going on. You do have the king of the realm, who is, like, plots within plots inside his head, and you have other characters that are plotting, and you have a much bigger plot, I think, being set up as well, which seems like that's going to get a little bit more into the mystical. So that's another thing I'm speculating with the next two books. I think we're going to go, as it's called the book, more into the dark, and look in the more mystical realms, whereas this, for the most part, was a pretty down-to-earth book. There are references to, like, the dark and, like, people who use magic and of some sort, and as we get further in, we learn more about some abilities that people have and that exist. So I'm wondering, too, if that's going to be the shift. I thought it was handled pretty well, because once again, we never really got a huge, like, info dump that, like, oh, this is the magic and this is the world. We kind of learned about it as we went along. We learned about, certain prophecies when characters were going to attack and, like, capture areas where those prophecies were coming out of. We learned more about abilities or, like, stories as they kind of came up. And a lot of the plots you don't, see as much happening until it's actually happening with like the political plots and everything going on there. So it's definitely one of those books where it really did kind of just slowly weave everything into it, and I thought it, for the most part, it was handled really, really well. So this was definitely an enjoyable story, and it's a pretty long book. I felt like I got through fairly quickly for the most part too. I did supplement. I mostly read the physical book, but I did supplement a little bit with audio, and I don't know the name of the narrator for the audio, but I was not a fan. I don't really normally do audiobooks at all, but I was trying to just kind of, since I was behind on this book coming out of January, I was trying to do a little bit of audio here and there, and so I would listen to a chapter when I was doing something where I couldn't read the physical book, and the narrator was just pretty boring. So I didn't do a ton of it there, and that's not really coloring my opinion at all. It wasn't bad. I still retained it, but it also just wasn't very good as a narrator. So if you are an audio person, I don't really recommend it. Granted, I don't have a lot of experience with audiobook narrators because it's not something I'm a huge fan of doing, but I was just kind of trying it out with this one. But the book overall, like I said, I think it's paced very well, and it definitely does coming of age, as found family, has a lot of those things, but it doesn't feel overly tropey either with the way that it's handled. And so that's why, like I said, I'm still very thankful that the school setting didn't really feel so much like a school setting, because I was really worried about that. But it does draw you in and weave it in, and it has to be very curious for what is going to happen in the next two books. And that's where, like I said, it honestly almost makes me more curious hearing that most people aren't as huge of a fan, because I do have some pretty unpopular opinions. So maybe I'll really like the next two books. Who knows? But I think I can see some of the things that will be different in those books based on how it did end. But it does set up to the world itself is just very interesting. We've got kind of our different. There originally were different kingdoms that were combined under the king, but we have, even in the realm, which is what it's called, you have different people who are, technically part of a fiefdom, but they don't really agree, or they, still have their different faith. A big theme of this too is that, the orders, they follow a specific faith, and anybody who doesn't is a heretic, and there are some people that are in the area that are. There's also a vast empire to the south that comes into play. The main place we start has a very Europe feel, with the empire to the south seeming to be Africa. This isn't done in a historical fiction by any way, but that's kind of the feel you get geographically. We also have pirate islands. We have the northern reaches, where we haven't spent a ton of time, which is supposed to have a pretty diverse group of people as well. And so we get lots of world building done, where we mention these different parts of the world, different cultures and religions, and a lot of that plays into the conflict as well, because of the fact that not only are there wars going on for profit or to keep the peace within the kingdom, or you have the faith elements too, where they want to wipe out people who are deniers, is what it's called in the book, and deny the one true faith for whatever their faith is. And all the time, as we're building out the world and learning about these different regions, a lot of the regions we kind of learn about as we see plots and characters move through them too, so it's not all dumped at once. But there are a lot of very specific different types of people that I feel like the peoples themselves also are developed pretty well. We learn a lot of it through just seeing the story as it happens, different customs and traditions, and more information about the people, about the world, and the way it kind of weaves together with also then having kind of the magical, mystical part of the plot weaved in there as well. I thought this was handled really well overall, and things kind of move in a pretty interesting way. So this is, I wouldn't say this is grimdark or anything, but it's a pretty. It does have some darker moments. It does have some brutal moments, and the world that's being set up is pretty brutal, with just, you've got all these different people, our main character being trained to be a warrior in very harsh environments. There is war, there's the political schemes. There's a lot of that kind of thing going on. So it's, I don't know. I'm not the genre police to say, but it's definitely a darker one if you like the kind of thing. And like I said, it has a lot of other elements that people tend to enjoy. And it managed to just not feel like it was really leaning too hard in any one trope by any means either. So that's also something I enjoyed. But overall, I thought this was a really well put together book. I definitely recommend it. I will have to read the next two to find out if I agree that they're not as good, but I don't see myself disliking them just based on my reaction to this book. This wasn't a book that I was like in love with, but it was a really enjoyable book, and I'm very interested to see where the story goes. So those are really my thoughts on Bloodsong. Definitely let me know your thoughts down in the comments if you agreed or disagreed with anything I said or what your general reactions were, and if they differed from mine in any way. I think this is a book that's definitely been read by quite a few people, so I imagine a lot of people will have thoughts, and I would love to hear them. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a like. Check the link in the description, as always, for the Wizardly Duo Discord if you want to chat this book, any books, really anything at all. It's a lot of fun, and we would love to have you. And of course, if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.